Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexander Akimov. I'm the president of Australasian Association for Communist and Post-Communist Studies. I will serve in today's session as Master of Ceremonies. So hopefully we'll have a good one. The aim of this online roundtable is to mark 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. For today's roundtable, which is inaugural roundtable for our association, we have partnered up with Griffith Asia Institute, and hopefully we'll continue benefiting from very productive collaboration with Griffith Asia Institute. So I would like to invite Professor Caitlin Burns, Director of Griffith Asia Institute, to provide an official welcome to the event. Caitlin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alexander, and welcome everyone. My name is Caitlin Byrne. I'm the director of the Griffith Asia Institute, and it really is a delight for me to be able to welcome you today to this seminar, 75 years since the end of World War II, talking about commemoration and historical understanding. Let me begin firstly by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today. For me, here in Brisbane, that's the Turrbal and the Jagera people, but of course many of you, including our panellists, are joining us from many other lands, so welcome. In the spirit of reconciliation, I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all First Nations peoples around the world. And let me also make a few acknowledgements of some of the special guests who are with us or joining us in this virtual platform as well. We're really pleased to be able to welcome Dr. Alexei Pavlovsky, Ambassador of the Russian Federation to the Commonwealth of Australia. Also, Satu Matila Burik, Ambassador of the Embassy of Finland. Mr. Marat Kalizanov, I hope I got that right, Consul General of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Ivana Izudovoric, Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of the Republic of Serbia. Alexei Katkov, Attaché, Embassy of the Russian Federation to Australia. And Lukas Graban, First Secretary of the Embassy of the Republic of Poland in Canberra. Welcome to you, and of course to all our guests. We're really pleased you're able to join us. Let me just take a minute to outline the format for today's webinar and introduce our panelists very briefly to you. We have asked each of the panelists today to begin with just a 5-minute overview of a key area of consideration for today's topic. And we will be beginning with Professor Roger Markwick from the University of Newcastle, who will really set the scene, talking about World War II, its objectives and aftermath. And he will be followed by Professor Mark Adele from the University of Melbourne, who's going to then look into the Soviet Union's Second World Wars, and in particular looking at history and memory. He will be followed by Associate Professor Alexei Muravyev, and Alexei will be going into a little bit of more detail, talking about the Red Machine in action, Soviet military power and the Allied victory in World War II. Followed then by Adjunct Associate Professor Slobodanka Vladiv-Glover from Monash University, who'll be taking us on a slightly different thread of discussion around narratives of the victors and the losers in World War II, particularly in the Balkans. Followed by Dr. Leonid Petrov, who will continue with the question really around World War II in Northeast Asia. Has it really ended? So as you can see, we have an interdisciplinary panel, a panel that draws together scholars from right across Australia, and I think you're in for an absolutely cracker discussion this afternoon. At the end of that, we'll be joined by Dr. Alexander Akimov, and Alexander is the current president of the Australasian Association for Communist and Post-Communist Studies. He's also a member of the Griffith Asia Institute, and we're really delighted to be working with Alexander today. Alexander will join us again at the end of that initial discussion to moderate the question and answers. And of course, you will all be welcome to submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can do that at any time during today's seminar. So that's probably enough from me. Let me begin by welcoming our panelists, and in particular welcoming Professor Roger Markwick as he opens the discussion today talking about World War II, objectives and aftermaths. Roger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caitlin. World War II, a huge topic to cover in any time, let alone in 10 minutes. I think the first thing to note about World War II, of course, is it was a very global war. In fact, I go so far as to say, in many respects, it was the first world war in reality. Of course, like a world war, it was extremely barbaric. An estimated, conservative estimate of the numbers of people who died, let alone all of those other people who were casualties, is that perhaps 50 million people died alone. And with it, cities and agriculture ravaged. In some respects, it was a continuation of World War I, but World War I, I'd suggest, was primarily, but not exclusively, a European war. For that, we could add the Middle East. But World War II stretched much further geographically, that's for sure. From Berlin to Beijing, Moscow to Tokyo, London to Singapore, even to Darwin, dare I say it. The war itself goes under a number of different titles, actually, depending on the perspective you have on it and where you sit. Sometimes referred to as the Good War, sometimes referred to as the anti-fascist war, and especially in Russia and the former Soviet Union, as the Great Patriotic War. Well, we're here to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of the war, but I'd suggest from the outset that there is a distinction to be made between commemoration and historical understanding. And I think that's really the primary task of the panel in front of us today in the discussion that we're pursuing. We need to understand what, in fact, is being commemorated. And to do that, we need to understand the players in this war and what was at stake for them, their interests. If I can just quote from Clausewitz's famous dictum, almost a cliche, I think, in war studies: war is a continuation of politics by other means. And I would go so far as to say, of course, nation states in particular have all sorts of means of asserting their interests, but war, and particularly total war, is really the ultimate weapon in doing so. So when we look at the objectives in this particular war, the standard narrative really is that World War II started with the Nazi invasion of Poland on the 1st of September and then ended on the 8th or 9th of May 1945. But I suggest we should cast our net wider. I'd suggest, in fact, in many respects, that's quite a Eurocentric view of the nature of this war. We need to cast out our net wider conceptually, geopolitically, and temporally in that regard. When we look at the principal players, and I'm only talking about the principal players, we see on the one hand what we might call the Axis powers, principally Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and on that side too, military fascist Japan, who, by the way, back in 1936 had at least signed the so-called Anti-Comintern Pact. Then in July 1941, and here I am focusing obviously on the European theatre, we see the formation of the Grand Alliance, exclusively the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, with, let's say, support from, at that stage, defeated France. It's pretty clear, I don't think there's any ambiguity about the fact that the Axis powers were the aggressors in this particular war. But there's something that I think we need to look at in this regard, step back a little bit, and that is in terms of the broader perspectives in terms of their place in the world. And what's striking about all of those nation states that I mentioned as Axis aggressors, was that they're essentially late capitalist industrializers. And they found themselves arrayed, in this instance, against the Grand Alliance in particular, they were arrayed against the old imperial powers. The UK, France, such as it was, and the rising capitalist hegemon in the world, the United States, plus another late industrializer, if you like, Stalin's semi-industrialized socialist state. Now, in terms of objectives, Germany, I think, very hard to summarize those objectives, but I would say their number one priority, the consistent thread, was a desire to have their own Raj, so to speak, Lebensraum, essentially in the Soviet lands. Now, that waxes and wanes, we know that. And with a view, ultimately, to becoming a world power. That is, to challenge on that basis, having conquered the former Soviet lands, to challenge Anglo-American dominance as a long-term perspective. Italy, too, Germany's ally, much weaker, of course, militarily, industrially, and so forth, sought to reassert itself in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and Southern Europe. If we turn, however, if we cross to the Pacific, we can see that Japan is asserting itself as early as 1931. A resource-hungry Japan occupied Manchuria in that year. By 1937, it had actually invaded China itself. A general war had opened up against China, conducted by the Japanese. And to that extent, I would suggest, in fact, for the Chinese in particular, World War II began in that year and wouldn't really end, well, let's take 1945, but I'd suggest even 1949. At the same time, Japan actually, for a short time, was engaged in conflict with the Soviet Union, but suffered a terrible, well, a defeat, let's call it a defeat without exaggerating too much, which happened to coincide with the German-Soviet non-aggression pact that Stalin sprung on the world in August of 1939, and which became a green light, essentially, for the German invasion of Poland. Japan was certainly on the march, but the United States wasn't going to just accept this unilateral, just accept this lying down. They were opposed, the United States was opposed to Japanese conquest of China and French Indochina. And on that basis, in July of 1941, Franklin Roosevelt basically tightened the blockade on the Japanese, which really, simply put, was a casus belli. It provoked, in effect, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and then generalized war between those two powers. But Europe remained the main theatre. Britain certainly feared Germany's challenge to the British Empire. They feared German domination of Europe. There were those in the British political class who sought to appease Chamberlain for a while. They hoped, I think it's true to say, to turn Germany's interests eastward towards the Soviet land. And that was exactly what I think Stalin in particular feared. He feared, as he always had, Anglo-French collusion against the Soviet Union. So therefore, in September of 1938, when the Munich Agreement was signed without Soviet presence in effect, I think that actually triggered opened the way to the surprise Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact, which really provided the green light for the German invasion of Poland, and then, more broadly, European war. In effect, I think Stalin was actually, with that non-aggression pact, buying time for the feared war, but that war came actually more soon than he expected, and that, of course, opened in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa. I'd suggest that it's the Eastern Front in particular, which really is the axis of World War II. There's no doubt about that. That was where Germany conducted and its allies conducted its genocidal war against, as they call it, Judeo-Bolshevism, with all the terrible costs that came with that. Essentially, in that regard, the Soviet state was actually fighting for its very existence. But it gained support in that war from, in fact, what might have seemed to be unlikely allies, people who weren't necessarily, states that weren't necessarily sympathetic, if not were hostile towards the Soviet Union. Notably, Churchill in Britain and Roosevelt in the United States. To a certain extent, I think those two powers gave some support to that war effort. We can't deny that, but in fact, in terms of blood and war material, the Soviet Union really took the brunt of that war. And ultimately, as we know, the Red Army was victorious. After 1943, post-Stalingrad, victory for the Red Army, that changed the tide and changed, I think, changed the relationship within that Grand Alliance. Because it really opened up, once the Red Army was on the march, a race for Berlin. That is, US and Britain on the one side, concerned that, in fact, the Red Army would occupy Central and Eastern Europe. And that suggests that, in fact, already the underlying enmity between these powers was beginning to emerge. The seeds of a Cold War were already being sown. Churchill, of course, in the wake, not of course, but did in the wake of the defeat of Germany, very quickly, basically, I think, revealed what had always been his sentiment, that Bolshevism, communism, the Soviet Union was a threat to Western interests. And it's in March of '46 that he delivers his famous Iron, or infamous perhaps, Iron Curtain speech, which really signals a very dramatic change in terms of relations between these erstwhile allies. If I can quickly turn then to the aftermaths of this war. I'd say without a doubt, if there was a winner, because a lot of people lost, and a lot of people lost their lives, we certainly know that. I think the United States emerges actually as the major winner from this war. It emerges as a hegemonic, capitalist, nuclear-armed superpower. And because of that, based on a kind of what Roosevelt actually referred to as a sort of anti-imperialist stance, the United States was actually able to and actively worked to displace the old European empires, including its close ally, Britain. And at the same time began to incorporate the defeated West Germany and Japan into a Soviet, anti-Soviet alliance. On that basis, we see, as we know, a divided Europe, essentially armed camps, a Cold War, which saw on the one hand Western powers, Britain and the United States in particular, essentially arraying themselves against the Soviet Union and those countries in Central Europe that it had decided, with the agreement actually of Churchill and so forth, were in its sphere of influence. And I'd suggest, despite the, perhaps because of the kind of military bureaucratic imposition of that Soviet presence in East Central Europe, that this was essentially a defensive step, even though it looks expansionary. It was effectively, from Stalin's perspective anyway, the construction of a glacis against what they feared as a revanchist Germany or other Western powers. But we should also remember it's not just Europe. World War II unleashed revolutions and anti-colonial struggles Yugoslavia, Indonesia, India, Vietnam, and notably, of course, the Chinese Revolution of 1949. In August of 1945, we shouldn't forget, the United States dropped atomic bombs, 2 atomic bombs on Japan. And a lot of argument has occurred about why they did that. Often as not, it's justified in terms of ending the Pacific War. But others have suggested, and frankly, I think this is justified in terms of thinking in these terms. In many respects, it was the opening shot, so to speak, in the Cold War, in terms of who was the dominant power in the world, who had the wherewithal to assert their politics in the terms that Clausewitz, for example, suggested: continuation of politics by, in this case, atomic means.
Thank you, Roger.
In that basis, though, Cold War in Europe, but hot wars were raging in the colonial world, notably Vietnam and Korea. So to conclude, I think we can say that many of the geopolitical cleavages 75 years after this war still remain, maybe are even reasserting themselves. So in that sense, I think it's reasonable to ask, and perhaps, in fact, I think it should be a question for discussion: in what sense did World War II really end or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger, for setting this good backdrop for further discussion in your chronological overview of the events. So now I'd like to invite Professor Mark Ederle to say a few words to us about the Soviet Union's Second World War's history and memory. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I will sort of begin where Roger ended, I think. So we're 75 years after a victory over Germany and Japan, and some of the effects of the Soviet Union's Second World War are still very much with us. We can think of the shape of modern Poland, Russia's Kaliningrad region, Finland's borders with Russia, the ongoing dispute over the Kuril Islands, the continued division of Korea, for example. In other respects, however, I think the results of this war have been unmade by subsequent histories. Cities and villages were rebuilt, families reconstituted, armies demobilized. With the notable exceptions mentioned just at the beginning of my talk, the geopolitical results of this war are largely gone, or at least overlaid with the consequences of later developments. The fall of the Soviet Empire in 1989, the breakdown of the Soviet Union itself in 1991, and the wars of Yugoslav succession between 1991 and 2001 all fundamentally reshaped the Eurasia the war had made. Memory has also transformed. Most of those who experienced the war as adults, as soldiers, as workers, as farmers, as prisoners, as resistance fighters, as collaborators, as perpetrators, as victims, most of them have passed on. Increasingly, World War II is moving from the realm of living memory into that of cultural commemoration. And this commemoration is fractured and uneven. It's splintered along national, political, generational, ethnic, and other lines. Russians continue to remember the Great Patriotic War of 1941-45, a heroic experience of not only defending the nation, but also saving the world from Nazism. Most historians in the West have accepted today the simple fact that it was the Soviet Union which won the war in Europe, although some, particularly in Britain, now try to unmake this consensus. In Poland, the Baltic states, and increasingly in the historiography elsewhere, meanwhile, the memory that World War II in Europe began on 1st September 1939 with the German attack on Poland is alive and well, together with the recollection that on the 17th of September, the Red Army invaded from the east. During the years of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, so that is 39-41, the Soviet Union did not appear to East Europeans as a force of liberation or even of anti-fascism, but as the totalitarian twin of Nazism, parceling up Eastern Europe, annexing neighboring countries, waging war on Finland. The memory of these dark years continues to cloud Russia's relationship with many of its neighbors, especially the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, but also with Poland. Meanwhile, the wartime experience of Jews in any of what are now the successor states of the Soviet Union was structured by the Nazi genocide and the memory of local collaboration. In this context, similar histories can assume fundamentally different meanings. Jewish and Polish citizens of the dismantled Polish state who were deported by Stalin as class enemies in 1940 or 1941 and survived the war in the Soviet Union, these Poles and Polish Jews shared the same sufferings. They shared similar deprivations. The survivors and the descendants, however, remember this experience in diametrically opposed ways. To Jews who returned to an anti-Semitic graveyard after the war, this history became one of Holocaust survival, while to Poles, it morphed into a larger story of Polish victimization. Memory in Eastern Europe is thus not a matter of Russia against the rest, as one can sometimes read. The embrace of many in Ukraine of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, as predecessors of their contemporary state, not only aggravates Russians, whose fathers or grandfathers might have fought them at war's end. It also alienates Poles, who remember the ethnic cleansing of 1943, and it raises alarm bells in Germany or in Israel, countries Kiev might like to have as allies in its contemporary struggle. To further complicate the memories of these events, the Soviets fought their world war not only in Europe, but also in Asia. The centrality of the battles of Lake Khasan and Khalkhin Gol in 1938 and 1939 for further developments in Asia and the Pacific is at times remembered. Soviet victory in this border war played a crucial role in shifting Japan's focus south and thus bringing, in the end, the United States into the war, which was a momentous event in the global history of this war. More often forgotten is that for Soviet Koreans, World War II started in 1937 as a result of, or in response to, the beginning of war in Asia. Fearing they might serve as a fifth column for the Japanese imperialists after war broke out in China, Stalin had all Koreans deported from the Far East. To Soviet Korean veterans, this war was punctuated by this deportation of 1937 at the one end, and the attack on Japan in the summer of 45 on the other, where they often served. The battles in the West, which shape European memory, were but a distant echo. How should historians deal with these disparate memories? One way, surely, is to take sides with the one or the other narrative. Another is to think of them as something akin to, quote, a cubist image of the Soviet Second World War, to cite my colleague and co-author Iva Glisic. They give multiple viewpoints, multiple beginnings, and multiple ends. To write a history which synthesizes these into an inclusive narrative will be all but impossible. Too desperate are the perspectives, and too large the blind spots, or even the outright and mutually exclusive denials of what took place. But it might be possible to write a history which puts at least some of these partial and partisan memories into tension and into dialogue. Such a history would have to start with the Korean deportations of 1937 and go well beyond 1945 to take into account the war after the war in the Western borderlands, that is in the newly annexed regions of formerly of Poland, as well as the three Baltic republics, as well as the various retreats from exposed positions in South, East, and north. It's often forgotten that the Soviets stood actually much further into Asia and also into Europe than where they ended up. So they didn't keep everything they had. It would give the Soviet Union, such a history would give the Soviet Union recognition for winning the war against Hitler without obscuring Stalin's crimes and Soviet aggression in Eastern Europe. It would note the dirty war the Soviets often fought without elevating their enemies, Ukrainian, Latvian, Lithuanian, or Estonian nationalists, to say nothing of the Germans, to hero status. It would remind readers that China played a vital role in keeping Japanese ground troops bogged down throughout the war, and hence the Soviet Eastern Front calm until the summer of 1945. It would stress that Russians shouldered the heaviest burden of the fight against Nazism, but also point out that the Red Army was a multinational force. Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, Koreans, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and many others also died in the struggle to defeat Hitler's Wehrmacht. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for reminding how complex and multidimensional World War II was. So now I would like to invite Associate Professor Alexei Muraviev, and he'll be talking about the Red Machine in action, Soviet military power, and the Allied victory in World War II. Over to you, Alexei.
Alexei.
And now you can hear me. Again, good afternoon to all, and thanks very much, Alexander. I trust you can see my slides. Taken from what Mark and to some extent Roger was saying, effectively what I would like to do, and being strategic and defense studies expert, I want to look at one particular aspect of the Soviet involvement in the Second World War, something that actually is becoming more and more of a discussion point in recent years, but something that actually began being tested even back in the 60s and the 70s during the years of the Cold War. Let me just share just a couple of points to set the scene. This is the map that has been taken from one reputable academic source that effectively describes or illustrates and provides some wording about major battles that were fought on the European front during World War II. And whilst the map is showing that the action didn't just take place in Western Europe and in Sicily and Italy and in Northern Africa, it does actually provide an illustration of the campaign that was fought on the Eastern Front. If you scroll down, and I'm not sure how well the readers can read it, into effectively the description, the wording description of the major phases of the war, there is only one small minor reference to the Soviet involvement or the Red Army contribution to the Allied effort in defeating the Third Reich. So that raises the first 2 points that I would like to address in my presentation. First of all, the scale of this contribution, as well as the price of victory. And the price of victory, by the price of victory, I mean this ongoing debate on how the Soviets managed to win or secure their part of the war by simply outsmarting and outskilling the Germans, or by simply overwhelming them with human power and paying the ultimate cost of simply dumping in bodies, and by that simply overrunning the machine of the Third Reich. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Similar goes for the Pacific Theater, and something that already been mentioned by 2 of my esteemed colleagues, a reference to the Soviet brief but nonetheless contribution to the Allied campaign in the Pacific. As this map once again demonstrates, there is not even a single reference to what was happening in Manchuria and Korea in the final months of 1945, the final year of the war in the Pacific. And there's certainly no reference or acknowledgement of the Soviet involvement in the war. The emphasis is entirely on the Allied involvement, the war in the Pacific, the war for the islands, and maritime battles that were fought across the Pacific Maritime Strategic Theater. So the first point I want to address is obviously with regards to the Allied war in Europe. And this is where I want to make the first point, which I think it's really important and often gets missing. There is often a reference that the war between that the war on the Eastern Front was fought between the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. A correction is required. When the Soviets were invaded on June 22nd, 1941, they were invaded by the combined forces of the Third Reich. It wasn't just the force that consisted the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces at that time, but there was an additional firepower provided by what we now would describe as coalition or allied partners. At least half a dozen European countries contributed significant military assets in addition to the Wehrmacht that marched across the Soviet boundary. And this is something that is important to remember. Overall, again, you know, given time restraints, the presentation comprises a sequence of concluding points. Happy to elaborate in the discussion. The ferocity of the fighting, which is illustrated by the intensity of the actual fighting, if you look at the lower end of the slides, compared to other major campaigns that were fought on the European and African strategic theaters of war at that time, has resulted in the outcome that's been presented here. On average, over 70% of Third Reich's, not just Germany, but Third Reich's combat potential was effectively wiped out by the Red Army. That is linked to human casualties, including the fatalities, major military hardware, and the overall fighting capacity to wage war. That is also linked to another question, which is on the combat effectiveness. There's been a lot of recent discussions and debate at what was the cost of that victory, what did the Soviets pay as their ultimate price, and quite often it's linked to this narrative that the Soviets have lost nearly 27 million people, and that was effectively sacrifice multiplied through war, immediate war losses, but also through ongoing political purges, repressions, and so on and so forth. And only minor element was attributed to the atrocities carried out by the Nazis and their collaborators. However, clear analysis by applying the military logic and military analysis towards available data concerning available troops, reinforcements, fatalities, and associated casualties and across major battles, as well as the overall outcome of the war, allowed assuming that the combat ratio or the fighting ratio between the Soviet troops, the Red Army, and Wehrmacht, that excludes satellite armies that fought alongside of Wehrmacht, was not that much difference. So some propositions that the Soviets lost 5 times or 4 times more than Wehrmacht simply because they were unskilled, inequipped, lack of strategic vision, lack of operational art, actually a false proposition. And that needs to be understood, first of all, in the context of how did the war start. The fundamental difference between the fighting on the Eastern Front and fighting elsewhere when it comes to European and African theaters of war is, first of all, the scale of operations. We're talking about, in 1941, the Soviets were confronted with 4,000 kilometer long strategic front of a combined coordinated assault. The bulk of Third Reich's firepower was concentrated for the invasion and of the Soviet Union and subsequent execution of Operation Barbarossa. And that obviously resulted, and there was an element of surprise when the Germany managed to, when the Germans, the Nazis, the Third Reich managed to outskill the Soviets and achieve operational and tactical levels of surprise by effectively invading and catching the Soviets in non 100% prepared stage. And obviously that resulted in the most considerable losses that the Soviets have lost in the first 2 years of the war, during which they effectively lost in excess of 3,000 combatants, including over 2 million prisoners of war, the majority of which were taken in the first 12 months of the fighting. But 27%, almost 30% of the entire combat losses they have taken during the first 6 months. But that 6 months also demonstrated this is not going to be a piece of cake for the experienced Nazi machine. In the first 6 months of the Eastern campaign, the Nazis managed to capture approximately same size in terms of size and scale of the territory. They were able to secure over approximately 3 years of fairly methodical penetration of Eastern Europe, of the Balkans, of Western Europe. But the scale of the losses that the German machine have suffered during 3 years was incomparably lower, 4 times lower to what they have taken from the Soviets in the first 6 months of fighting, which already demonstrated to them that whilst they were winning by skill and by superior operational art, it wouldn't be an easy work for them, and it proved to be quite fatal towards the end. And in fact, if you start looking and applying some methodological approaches towards analyzing combat effectiveness on the basis of available forces that were committed to any particular battles, reinforcements that they have received, as well as taking into account total losses. And there is a variety and disparity on how different countries look into calculating them, when they would, on one hand, for example, in some cases acknowledge just killed in action and injured, but would not be factoring in prisoners of war, missing in action, the ones that would require long-term recovery, and so on and so forth. But if you amalgamate all these figures and break them down into ratio of troops committed to the battle, you would actually see that whilst in the first stages of the war, the Red Army have suffered more from the Germans, towards the end of the war, the actual performance was almost on one-on-one basis, and certainly even in the battle for Berlin, which is considered to be one of the bloodiest battles in the Second World War, the Soviets were actually outperforming the Nazis and Allied forces. Another factor that needs to be taken into account is what was available for battle. In the majority of cases, because of heavy losses that the Soviets have suffered in the initial years of the war, they were engaged in subsequent battles, including during their strategic counteroffensive, by employing units that were understaffed and under-equipped compared to similar units employed even in the darkest hour by the Wehrmacht and Allied forces. So, for example, Nazi divisions would be 100% equipped, or at worst 80 to 90% equipped of their required strength, whilst at best times in campaigns of 1944-1945, Soviet divisions were at best equipped by 50 to 60% of the required personnel as well as firepower. So that actually concludes that the Soviets were winning not simply by the numbers, but through applying superior operational art, by applying very skillfully the element of surprise, by engaging in successful intelligence gathering, as well as counterintelligence deception operations, catching Germans by surprise time and time again, and maneuvering forces that were available to them, and by that achieving superior results. The ultimate success and the contribution that the Soviets made to the Allied effort was clearly demonstrated in the final campaign, which was fought not in Europe, but a few months after the end of hostilities in Europe, in the Far East, when the Soviet Union, as a result of agreement in Yalta in early 1945, committed to a strategic offensive on Japan, even though Japan was on retreat. There was an expectation that Japan could still carry on with fighting, in particular whilst retaining sizable portion of their ground forces stationed in Manchuria and parts of China. So for the Allies, eliminating that element of the Japanese war machine, whilst they were dealing with the Japanese Imperial Navy and the Air Force, as well as garrisons on a chain of islands, was a matter of strategic importance. And it wasn't just an easy drive against the enemy that's been weakened by almost 4 years of never-ending fighting. The Japanese, whilst taking losses elsewhere, were still able to retain significant presence in the Far Eastern Strategic Theater. By the Soviets, when they moved in with a superior force, they managed to overwhelm and effectively achieve the campaign, liberating an equivalent of the size of entire European continent in 10 days. And in terms of combat performance, once again, also based on the calculations of combat losses, that actually demonstrated that by the time the Soviets entered the war in the Pacific, they were by far the most superior conventional military force that actually made a very significant contribution to the overall Allied effort that helped to conclude the war, the Second World War, in early September 1945, without having any expectations that the war could carry on for at least another 1 or 2 years. Certainly, with regards to, in conclusion, with regards to European strategic theater, the Soviets managed to not just overwhelm the initial assault by the combined force of the Third Reich. Once again, I want to emphasize on that, not just the Nazi Germany. They managed to effectively digest and overpower over 70% of the entire fighting potential that the anti-Nazi coalition was confronted, and they still made their final contribution to the Allied war effort in the Pacific by saving thousands of lives of Allied personnel, including Australian servicemen and women that were fighting in that war. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Alexei. Thank you for sharing with us kind of less known facts and the analysis of military aspects of World War II. Now I would like to shift the attention to the Balkans. So we've got Joint Associate Professor Slobodanka Vladiv-Glover talking about narratives of the victors and losers about World War II in the Balkans. Over to you, Slobodanka.
Much, everybody. Can you see my screen? No. Oh, yes, you can see it now, right? Only it's the wrong picture. Yes, here we go. I'm going to refer back to what Roger said, the framework that he gave us for this discussion. And I'm the only non-historian present, so you will not get any figures and facts from me. You will get a few facts, but mainly impressions which are impressions of how the winners and the losers were treated or perceived after the war. So Roger said that the axis of World War II was on the Eastern Front, and the Balkans, which I'm supposed to talk about, they were a small gloss, a small prologue to that axis, because I'm showing you a picture here of what the Balkans look like over 50 or 70 years. Nothing has changed outside the big cities. So this is somewhere in the Banat, somewhere in the 60s, but it still looks like that today. So this is the reality of the Balkans. It's still like that in the countryside, in many places. The prologue to the big axis of war in Operation Barbarossa by the Germans was this little country called Yugoslavia, Royalist Yugoslavia, which was bombed by Germany, by the Axis powers, on the 6th of April 1941. And I know the story of this day so well because my parents lived through it, and I was told this story every birthday or every anniversary. The story was trotted out. The whole family was there, was involved in this bombing, and it became a sort of family memory and part of the family lore. So the bombing of Belgrade was preceded by the putsch, the March 27th putsch by a group of Serbian Air Force officers led by Marshal Simovic against the signing of the tripartite pact, or Yugoslavia's accession to the tripartite pact, by the government of Dragiša Cvetković, who was acting in the government of under the regency of Prince Paul, because King Peter II was a minor at this time. He was 17 years old. And the putsch was staged by royalists, not by the partisans, but the members of the Communist Party, which was outlawed in Yugoslavia in 1920. They were on the streets, and they were protesting and crying. There was this slogan, better war than the pact, bolje rat nego pakt. So Prince Paul resigned the regency, and he resigned, the regency was abolished, and a new government of Simovic was created in exile. Simovic impersonated the king's speech and a proclamation to the people, and the 17-year-old king was pronounced to be of age to head the national unity government in exile in London. In the country, in Belgrade, Milan Nedić, the former chief of the general staff of the Royal Yugoslav Army, became the prime minister of the so-called government of national salvation, which was a government actually controlled by the occupying German forces. It's called the puppet government, but what can you do if you are being controlled by an occupational force? They didn't call it puppet government in Switzerland, did they? Anyway, this is the king in London, with on the left General Dusan Simovic in June of 1941. The king is 17 years old here. You can see that he's just a boy, a schoolboy. Now, the German occupation, with the German occupation on the 6th of April 1941, started the dismantling of Yugoslavia, and the formation of different groups, guerrilla groups, and the formation of the independent state of Croatia, whole territory, the NDH, as well as the territory of the military commander of Serbia, which is occupied mainly, it's occupied by the Germans, but the guerrilla group active there is Dimitrije Ljotić, the so-called Ljotićevci. So we have the Yugoslav government in exile. We have the government of national salvation in Belgrade. We have the independent state of Croatia, established on the 10th of April 1941, which lasted until, sorry, something is wrong with my mouse. I'm sorry to do this to everyone. Which lasted till the 8th of May 1945, headed by Ante Pavelić. So some people are saying that this was not really, Yugoslavia was not entering a world war, it was entering a civil war, because the main fighting was between the various guerrilla groups, to which one could also count the Croatian Domobrani, the Croatian Ustashi, and here are the Serbs. Draža Mihajlović, who formed a group called the illegal Chetniks. So these were Chetnik detachments of the Yugoslav army, also known as the Yugoslav army in the homeland, or the Ravna Gora movement, because Ravna Gora is a place in Serbia where Draža established his headquarters. The Chetniks made a number of agreements with the Germans in 1943, bypassing the Serbian puppet government, which resulted in Nedić and his regime losing what support it had left amongst the people. many members of Nedic's administration, including government officials as well as military and police officers, made secret deals with the Chetniks themselves. So there were a lot of, the question of collaborations and who collaborated with whom and who made agreements with whom is fraught with tremendous controversy to this day. So even this is too much for me to say. So maybe you could just erase this from your memory. So something is not working with my slides. Okay. Dmitry Ljotic, who was the leader of the so-called legalized Chetniks, he was a Serbian intellectual. To call him a fascist is too simplistic, according to the historian Jozo Tomašević. And just incidentally, after the war, and after people were released from POW camps, many of the supporters of Dmitry Ljotic found their way into Australia. And I knew some of the families in Melbourne. We went to the same church, the same Serbian church in Melbourne. And these people were people from the countryside, mainly sort of provincial intellectuals, who had to join some group which was not the Nazis and which was not the Ustashi. So many of these groups, guerrilla groups, the Chetniks and the Ljotic groups, they were created under the pressure of not going with the enemy, not going with the Ustashi. Sorry, next slide. Now, the partisans were a multi-ethnic group, and they formed the National Liberation Front, or in Serbo-Croatian, Narodno-oslobodilačka vojska. They organized the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, which was extremely well organized already in the 30s, underground. It had lots of networks. In fact, one of the reasons why they were so strong as a group during the war is because they already had the apparatus, whereas none of the other groups had that. No one was prepared for war. None of the Yugoslav monarchist groups, Chetniks, Ljotic, whatever, the National Army, they were not prepared for war. But these guys were prepared for war, and the Communist Party of Yugoslavia organized the so-called Vojni komiteti, army committees. And they did that. They didn't believe the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. They were clever. They read through it and they thought they better be prepared. This is not going to last. So there was a partisan uprising mainly in Western Serbia, with partisan headquarters commanding 14,000 fighters in 23 local squads and so on. So the other group, which was formed on the former territory of Royal Yugoslavia, was the new state of Croatia, the independent state of Croatia, also called Ustashi, and there was a subgroup called Domobrani, Home Guard. It was the Croatian revolutionary movement, covering the territories of Croatia, Dalmatia, parts of Vojvodina and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And they had an explicit Nazi racial ideology, and they fought both the partisans and the Serb local populations. They were organized. They had the status of kind of a country. Now that's the context. Those are the participants. Now, how do they pan out during the war and after the war? Well, during the war, we have the narrative of Western diplomacy. Here is the king. He is sheltered by the Western powers in London. He is up to a point feted by the Western allies. Here he is with Churchill and Roosevelt, while the Western powers play a waiting game, especially Churchill playing a game of seeing who is going to make good in the Balkans. Then we have the Serbian side, the Draža Mihailović camp, and the narrative of the victors actually starts with the trial of Draža Mihailović after the war. He was, at the very end of the war, he was captured 4 months before he was executed on the 10th of June 1946. with 8 other chetniks. He was executed very close to the king's palace in Topčider in Lisičji Potok. You can see here that his trial was something like the Nuremberg trials. It emulated the Nuremberg trials. So this was the narrative of the victorious partisans after the war, and all the textbooks were full of, you know, the whole narrative after the war in Tito's Yugoslavia was that these were criminals, these were war criminals, whereas Draža Mihailović, as you can see here, looks weak, looks defeated, and it has really a terrible end. He is, however, rehabilitated. The Americans award Mihailović posthumously the Legion of Merit for the rescue of Americans during World War II. This honor is accepted by his daughter Gordana in 2005 during the Bush administration. In 2004, the current Serbian government, you know, the post-communist Serbian government, passes a law that grants partisans and chetniks equal place in Serbian history. And in 2006, the law is passed to rehabilitate former chetniks. So that's the end of this narrative. Now, a little bit on a lighter note, I only spent my first 10 years in Tito's Yugoslavia. After that, my parents took me away and we came on a journey of migrations. But even while I was a child in Yugoslavia, we all sang this song. And I even had a barjak like this. I had a little toy, just like this little girl or boy here. And I walked around the apartment of my parents singing this song. Now, I don't know if it's going to work, but it was the song of, "We are Tito's young army. Our whole people are with us. Our country is free, and let Tito live well. Let Tito be healthy." I don't know if I can play this. I couldn't play it before on my. You said you could, Alexander, but I can't play it. I don't know if we have time.
Yeah, well, let's move on probably.
Okay, let's move on. Okay. Now, the popular imagination was also filled with narratives about NOB, the Narodno-oslobodilačka borba, the national liberation battle, the battle for national liberation. And you have these 2 famous films, which were co-produced and co-produced with foreign companies. And the films are about the 2 major offensives fought by the partisans in the Second World War against the Germans. The Battle of Sutjeska, the film was made in 1973, was the most expensive film ever made in Yugoslavia, based on the 5th offensive, which was the greatest engagement of the Yugoslav partisans during the war. And the screenwriter for that was Sergei Bondarchuk, amongst others. The other film was called The Battle of Neretva, and as you can see, Yul Brynner on this. So a lot of money was thrown into this kind of narrative of NOB. It was also part of the school syllabus, part of the history, and so on. Now, the narrative of the Western Allies starts with Tito after 1948. After Tito breaks with Stalin, the so-called Informbureau, disaligns himself from the Soviet Union for the next 5 years at least, until Khrushchev. He is welcomed in the West, and he is feted everywhere. As you can see, Tito in London in 1953, Tito in almost a filial relationship with Churchill. This is in 1960, where Tito is hosting Churchill somewhere on his island of Brioni. And he is also visited by many celebrities. So if you say, Roger, that the winners of World War II was America, just have a look at Tito. In every Yugoslav's opinion, Tito was a definite winner of World War II. So here he is with Sophia Loren and Elizabeth Taylor. These were all his guests. He had this big yacht called Galeb, the Seagull, and he had this island in the Adriatic, in the Adriatic, and he welcomed celebrity visitors, and he was playing the role of a gracious host. And here he is with other friends, Tito with his friends, the non-aligned movement friends, Nasser. This is in Belgrade. This is behind him is the Parliament House of Belgrade. Here he is with his other friend, revolutionary friend, Castro. And here is the non-aligned movement. This must be the Brioni shot when Tito hosted it. First it was in Bandung, but I don't think this is the Bandung conference. This is when Tito hosted it. And finally, here we have Tito with democracy and capitalism. We all know how it ended. It ended okay for him until 1980, but it didn't end so well for the rest of the country after that, going into another civil war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Slobodanka, for sharing us some of the knowledge about World War II on Balkans. You know, not that much known about it to the broader audience. So a bit of a help to bridge the gap. And we've got the final speaker for today is Dr. Leonid Petrov, who will shift the attention of World War II into Asia. And his topic would be World War II in Northeast Asia. Has it really ended? So over to you, Leonid.
Thank you, Alexander. I hope you and everyone can see my slide and hear me. And I would like to thank the Australasian Association for Communist and Post-Communist Studies for bringing up this wonderful idea to commemorate the events which happened 75 years ago. But also in my presentation, I would like to talk more about what happened later, a few months or even years. That's why I called my presentation the end, or really has the World War II ever ended, and how it happened in Northeast Asia. But Northeast Asia shows us poses many questions which haven't been answered yet. In my presentation, I probably should start with trying to pinpoint the starting moment of World War II in Northeast Asia. My colleagues, Roger, Mark, and Alexei have already mentioned the events of the hostilities. Mark tried to present the multitude of narratives of Second World War, like the Soviet Koreans who were deported from the Russian Far East, Central Asia. It started in September 1937. I'll also talk about the final moments of the war, or at least supposed to be the final moments, because it was not just 1945 when Japan surrendered, but the peace treaty was signed in 1951. And still we'll be talking about the legacies, and I think that since my presentation is the last in this row, so this will encourage more of the questions and answers and discussion. So I'll try to be as provocative as possible. So I put the rising sun flag here, which is still very much legal and official in Japan. It has been around for 1,000 years, and after the Second World War, it still reminds the neighbors of Japan the horrors of Second World War. But in Japan, it's still official, and even South Korean government complained that this flag was supposed to be accepted during the Olympics, Tokyo Olympics 2020, which were postponed. So will it happen next year? We will see. So first of all, when did the war start in Northeast Asia? Perhaps we can attribute it to the Manchurian incident, the Mukden incident, which was engineered by the Japanese Imperial Army near the city of Mukden, Shenyang these days, in Manchuria, which permitted Japan to turn the whole province of Manchuria into a so-called independent state, the Manchuria. Even the emperor of Manchuria was instilled at that time. This move cost Japan the seat in the League of Nations. Actually, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations, which actually we can make a comparison with the Soviet Union, which was expelled from the League of Nations in 1939 after the war against Finland. Right. If it was not 1931, perhaps it was 1937. The Marco Polo bridge incident, incident near Beijing, where the Imperial Army clashed with Chinese Nationalist Revolutionary Army, and the incident opened the gate of further Japanese expansion in continental China. After that, the atrocities of Nanjing and Shanghai happened. And perhaps many historians actually agree that World War II in Asia started in July 1937. Or we might attribute the beginning of hostilities to the attack, Japanese naval and aerial attack on Pearl Harbor, the US territory in Hawaii in 1941. US at that moment had been the neutral state, and since then war in the Pacific started. But probably we should not forget about the clashes between the Red Army and the Japanese Imperial Army in Inner Mongolia. The 1939 Khalkhin-Gol clashes could also be seen as the beginning of war in Northeast Asia, 1939 in Europe, 1939 in East Asia. So, how did it go? Well, Japan had different expansion doctrines. The so-called Northern Expansion Doctrine, which almost ended and was forgotten after this defeat in Khalkhin-Gol in eastern Outer Mongolia, where Japanese army realized that progression towards Siberia, Siberian oil was the target of the Japanese Imperial Army, was not going to end up well, particularly in winter time. And that's why after 1939, the so-called Southern Expansion Doctrine was adopted as the official direction for the Japanese Navy. And until the end of the war, until 1945, the Pacific theater was the main stage where American, Australian allied forces participated. Soviet Union had the neutrality pact with Japan, so there was no Soviet presence in this theater until the very last moment. So I won't go into the details of the Second World War since my presentation is about the ending. So let's try to find the exact time the war ended. Well, the US nuclear bombing of Japan, which happened twice on the 6th and 9th of August, Hiroshima and Nagasaki 3 days later, actually prompted the events which were unfolding very, very quickly. We saw that the Soviet invasion of Manchuria started the same day, coincided with the second nuclear bombing, when the Soviet army advanced towards Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, Southern Kurils, and Northern Korea. The expectations were that the Soviet army would occupy Manchuria and Korea and participate in the joint occupation of Japanese islands. But something happened, and it was 1945, 15th of August, when Hirohito, Japanese emperor, suddenly addressed the nation with his rescript about the acceptance of Potsdam Declaration, and unconditional surrender was promised. Some historians actually question how come that Japan, which actually promised another few years of fight against the allied forces in the Pacific and mainland China suddenly decided to surrender. And well, some historians offer the answer. These were the Soviet excesses in Manchuria and in northern Korea, which led the Japanese leadership to think twice about joint occupation and continuing a struggle against the Allied forces. It looked like what happened in Manchuria and in northern Korea, and Americans, I remind you, suggested to divide Korea along the 38th parallel in order to, officially, there was an explanation to prevent Russian excesses in that area. So suddenly Americans offered the joint occupation of Korea. Manchuria would be left in the hands of the Soviet army, and Japan was supposed to be totally occupied by the US forces. So some suspect that Hirohito simply decided that it's better to surrender to Americans instantly rather than to fight and experience the joint occupation of the Japanese islands. So we can see that Americans and Russians were the dominating forces in Northeast Asia. Chinese Republican Army was together, well, sharing, fighting against the Japanese together with the Communist Army of Mao Zedong. And later, this struggle turned into the civil war in China, which hasn't finished yet. We have two Chinese states, and we have two Korean states in North and South Korea who don't recognize each other. So that's why I think that we should look at the end of the, looking for the end of Second World War, not in the surrender or Hirohito's rescript about the acceptance, but probably in the, and not even in the Japanese instrument of surrender, which was signed in September on board of American Missouri ship with the presence of Japanese foreign minister who signed the instrument of surrender, and Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, Douglas MacArthur, accepted it. Officially, this unconditional surrender to the Allied powers is treated as the end of World War II in Asia, because Japanese imperial headquarters promised to surrender, and armed forces, all controls, every assets were supposed to stop and cease fighting. But what happened next is actually opening the question of end of Second World War to various interpretations, because the Cold War started immediately. The former allies already looked at each other as foes, and two Chinas and two Koreas turned into the civil wars. And during the Korean War, which started in 1950, the San Francisco Peace Treaty was summarily prepared. 51 countries were invited to participate in the San Francisco Peace Treaty signing. But China and Korea were not invited because apparently the organizers of the treaty didn't know whether to invite People's Republic of China representative or Republic of China representative, whether it's going to be the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which was fighting the UN troops and UN command on the peninsula with the help of Chinese people volunteers army, or was it going to be the Republic of Korea representative? So they decided to postpone the signing of peace with these four countries or two countries, depending on what was going to happen. So ultimately, on the 8th of September 1951, 48 countries decided to sign the peace treaty with Japan, but it wasn't Soviet Union, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. A few countries were not invited to the San Francisco at all, but it was there were a number of issues which Alexei Gromyko, the future foreign minister of the Soviet Union, listed during the conference. Just a few hours before the document was signed, he said that the treaty did not recognize many things, including the Soviet sovereignty of At that time, it was South Sakhalin and Kuril Islands. Well, later on, the Soviet Union managed to sort this out with Japan, but it didn't happen until 1956. Also, China's sovereignty over Taiwan was not clarified. Japan simply renounced its possession of Taiwan and the Pescador Islands, Spratly Islands, Paracel Islands. But these days we have big fights in South China Sea about these very islands. And also I'll return this slide, the Korean sovereignty over certain islands or certain territories like Tokto or Takeshima was not really specified in the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So to sum up my presentation, I'd like to say that the legacy of San Francisco Peace Treaty is very controversial. We see that mainland China and Taiwan, the province of China, still fighting with Japan over the Senkaku Diaoyutai Island, the Pinnacle Islands. Also, like North and South Korea still claim the possession of Liangkurt Rock, which is Tokto Island, known in Korea, and Takeshima Island, known in Japan. Still, the issues being brought to many international courts. And US troops remain in Okinawa despite of the ending of US military occupation, which happened immediately after the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty in 1952. It came into power. So US troops are still in Ryukyu Islands, and Russia is still discussing the future peace treaty with Japan, but it's linked to the possession of disputed South Korea Islands, which haven't been included into the San Francisco Peace Treaty. Even the memory and legacy of the human rights abuse and sexual slavery, it's called comfort women, still claim compensation from Japan despite of the certain article which mentioned the reparations which Japan would pay to the victims of the Second World War. So in many ways, I believe that peace treaty in San Francisco, signed in 1951, did not finish the war, and still we have many different interpretations of what happened during the Second World War, even how it started. So it's a work for historians to explain and interpret these issues, but history in East Asia is a very combustible area. So historical wars, not the real, hot war or cold war. We have history wars these days, which continue between China and Japan, between North and South Korea and its neighbors. And I believe that cooperation is needed. Not only historians, but politicians and also the activist groups also must tone down their aggression and animosity and look at the days and lessons of the past in a more amiable way. Thank you for your attention, and I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Leonid, for sharing with us intricacies of the end of World War II in Asia, which, again, probably I speak for myself, I didn't know much about, and was very useful and thought-provoking. So it's a time for a question. We've got a couple of questions posted on Q&A. Well, 3 now. So the first question was from Natalia Batova, and I think it's addressed to Mark. So Mark mentioned the problem of different narratives. How close can we get to marrying them? Mark, over to you.
Well, I guess we can try, but and I have tried in a book which will come out next year, but it is very difficult given that the politicization of these narratives in today's Eastern Europe and Asia is such that pretty much whatever you say, you will insult somebody, and very often you will insult multiple parties. So it will. I think it's very hard to not be controversial about this war. But I guess one can try, if one shifts perspectives and tries to tell that story from not just one standpoint, but try to, see it from, as I try to sketch very briefly in the example of the Polish deportees, where the story simply, that they get deported by Stalin or by the Soviets on order by Stalin as class enemies, essentially, and then get amnestied, quote unquote, in the summer of 1941 after the Germans invade, and the Soviets find themselves on the side of the exile government the Polish exile government in London. To Jewish Poles, that history is, while they remember the suffering and the injustice and so on, the overarching story is one of having inadvertently been saved by Stalin from Hitler, right? To Polish, if you then shift the same, is basically the same story for non-Jewish Poles. The implication of that story is simply completely different, right? And you can do that with nearly every turn of that history. If you shift the perspectives between different groups, the story changes. So one can try that, but it would become a very big book, I think.
Thank you, Mark.
I can add something, Alexei, Alexander, because I remember Natalia was asking this question. I promised I will try to address it in my presentation. And just one thing I would like to add, how can we resolve these historiographical battles? Well, historians have to talk to each other. They shouldn't be sitting in the ivory tower and writing inflammatory, kind of abusive articles and books, offending each other and people they represent. They have to have joint conferences, webinars. They have to write joint authored books like it was done between Chinese, Japanese, and Korean historians a few years ago. The book was called The History Which Opens the Future. History Which Opens the Future. They addressed the very controversial points of the past, of a particular period of history, and it was quite well accepted in 3 countries.
Thank you, Leonid. The second question came from Attaché Alexei Katkov, and it was a question to Roger. Roger, how do you see the impact of the Munich Treaty of 1938 on the start of World War II? Wasn't it the Munich Treaty that made the war inevitable when the appeasement policy went too far and the League of Nations proved ineffective? The Nazi Germany could have been stopped. This Czechoslovakia had more divisions, was a member of Little Entente. Sudetenland was well fortified and the USSR was ready to help. It's no coincidence that Churchill told Neville Chamberlain after Munich betrayal, you were given the choice between the war and dishonor, you choose dishonor and you will have the war. Roger?
Yes.
To you.
Thank you, Alexander. And thanks for that question. Actually, Alexei Muravyev contributed to a response to that question himself, asking, well, do we start with Munich or do we go back to the Spanish Civil War? I would certainly say that the Munich Agreement was a decisive turning point from the Soviet perspective because they were actually left out of the negotiations, as were the Czechs themselves. And as I said in my presentation, Stalin always had a deep suspicion of the French and the British in particular. His attitudes waxed and waned in relation to Germany, but of course Moscow became increasingly suspicious, concerned about the German military armament and so forth. And therefore, for having tried, I think, on the part of the Soviet Union under Stalin to form some kind of collective security agreement with Britain and France, whatever concerns, reservations, suspicions Moscow had about the intentions, particularly of Britain and also France. The very fact that it was excluded from that process meant, I think, that hastened a determination, in fact, hastened a determination on the part of Moscow to look elsewhere, to find another way out of what they thought by this time was more or less inevitable war. Not forgetting, of course, that Stalin had thought that war was likely back in 1931. He predicted that. So he was expecting at some stage a major conflict coming out of the West. Perhaps in the first place, France and Britain, increasingly from Germany. But if I can just step back a little bit, I mean, I think it is true. It's right to bring in the Spanish Civil War too. I mean, one could take this, these causal links, if you like, back quite a long way. But the Spanish Civil War itself is interesting because it, I think, also, Stalin, for his own reasons, was supporting, in his own way, the Spanish Republican government, which was under attack from both not only from Franco, but the Republican government, but also from forces from fascist Germany and fascist Italy. But there was a so-called non-intervention pact agreement established, which meant, oh, nobody could intervene, which was really driven by Britain and France. And that only fueled, I think, Soviet suspicions about the real intentions of Britain. Could they be relied upon to be an ally? I think, though, when it comes to Munich, that's a turning point. They can't be trusted no matter what they say. And it's interesting, in fact, that Churchill's cited here, because I think there's a split that, you know, I don't really have the details about, but it seems apparent to me that it was a split within the British political class about, well, who's our immediate enemy, if you like? And as I said earlier, Churchill was no lover of the Soviet Union, but he could see, I think, much more clearly than, say, Chamberlain and people of his ilk, that in fact, the most immediate threat to the British Empire was Germany itself, and he was prepared to sup with the devil, if you like, in a grand alliance against Germany, but always, I think, with a sense of, well, you know, we can this can be a temporary arrangement until we beat our major opponent, that is Nazi Germany.
Thank you, Roger. The next question is for Slobodanka. I can see the need for a nuanced reconsideration of Mikhailovich, but weren't Nedic and Ljotic virulent anti-Semites?
Well, I would like to know your source, because I have heard that also, but it's sort of like a Wikipedia judgment, and it's not exactly a historical judgment. I can't answer your question specifically because, as I said, I'm no historian, but there was no anti-Jewish sentiment as far as I know, and the people I know in Belgrade, either before the Second World War or after the Second World War. There was a Jewish synagogue, and this was not destroyed by anyone. This was not destroyed by Nedic or by Ljotic. The Jewish community did not go underground because of the Serbs. It went underground because of the Nazis who were occupying Belgrade and who were rounding up various people, including Jews, from time to time. There was Nedic. I haven't read anything by Nedic which would speak to your thesis. I haven't read anything by Ljotić, which would speak to your thesis. However, these people had sort of these kinds of theories about nationalism, about one's own, about the soil. You know, Heidegger was like that too. You know, Heidegger had this Erde theory, and it can be interpreted as a Nazi. It can feed into the Nazi ideology, but it was a widespread thing in the 1920s and 1930s, and even in the 19th century. I mean, Dostoevsky is accused of being a nationalist with his Pochva, you know, so it was I can see it along those lines. I can't see that they were virulent anti-Semites. Because I'm only speaking because there is no anti-Semitism amongst the Serbs. They lived along the Serbs for, I mean, the Jewish community was totally integrated amongst the Serbian community. They're Serbian Jews.
Thank you, Slobodanka. So there's a question to Alexei. Could you say a little bit more about Six Nation Coalition that fought alongside Germany against the USSR? How significant were they in terms of numbers? Did they fight effectively? Were their morale considerably lower than of the Germans, especially towards the end of the war?
Sure, and I'm bringing back the slide that kind of lists the countries that I identified as part of that coalition. First of all, thank you for the question. With regards to understanding the composition of the coalition or the allied forces that invaded the Soviet Union, there are two elements there. One is there were international units under the operational command of the Wehrmacht, but they were primarily under under Waffen-SS, which sat in some way been a semi-autonomous force. So operationally, they, at some point in time, they were under Wehrmacht command, but they were also exercising a degree of autonomy. So the majority of Nazi collaborators drawn from a variety of occupied nations were actually enlisted in the German, either in the German armed forces or predominantly in Waffen-SS. But there were also standalone military units drawn, either committed by countries that had allied relationship with the Third Reich, or drawn from the volunteers. So, for example, Italy contributed a number of field armies to the fighting on the Eastern Front, and in fact, the Italians and the Hungarians represented the Achilles foot for the Germans in the battle for Stalingrad. I mean, common knowledge is that the Soviets encircled two German armies in the Battle of Stalingrad with a total strength of about 300,000 personnel, and that's what really the Soviets managed to achieve there. The reality was that there were several Italian and Hungarian armies that also were part of the overall Battle of Stalingrad, and actually, in fact, the Soviets were targeting them given the fact that they were far more weaker, poor equipped, and certainly exercised far less morale compared to German forces. So there was obviously foreign presence in the battle for Stalingrad. In the battle for Moscow, Wehrmacht was supported by a voluntary army corps drafted from volunteers comprising French citizens. So there was a bit of an irony when back in 1812, Napoleon marched onto Moscow in charge of an international invasion force, and then a couple of centuries later, the French joined the Nazis in, well, not the French, but a number of French collaborators that formed independent Foreign Legion, joined the Nazis and took part in the battle for Moscow. Italy contributed at least one field division, the so-called Blue Division, which took part in the siege of Leningrad. It was actually accused of ransacking Soviet treasures, particularly on the outskirts of Leningrad. Finland committed a number of divisions that also took part in the siege of Leningrad, also drawn on their hostility towards the Soviets as a result of the so-called Winter War that they have lost in a year earlier. So these were the countries that you can see on the screen that committed significant independent combat formations from field division upwards. So that needs to be taken into account with regards to understanding the combined invasion force and the combined adversary force that the Red Army had to deal with. And I said there were smaller scale collaborations, but they were certainly part of, they were made part of the Wehrmacht. I mean, for example, there were about 1 million ethnic Russian collaborators that formed a number of divisions, but they were all enlisted under Wehrmacht or Waffen-SS. Same goes for some Ukrainian collaborators, Belgians, and the list goes on. So that's what I meant when I talked about the allied allies to the Third Reich. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Alexei. Alexei, if you can answer there's one more question from Anna to you by typing, but I will exercise my moderator's right to ask the last question and will be addressed to Leonid. Leonid, would you elaborate quickly on why Poland and Czech Republic didn't sign San Francisco Agreement?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious. The communist bloc already was being created at that time, 1951. Cold War was already reaching its height. The Korean War was probably the hot episode of this Cold War drama. But well, Czech and Polish republics, well, they were there. They refused to sign to support the Soviet Union because the USSR was not happy with this arrangement. The draft of the San Francisco Peace Treaty was obviously done without consideration of Soviet geopolitical interests, including the Kuril Islands, and we remember as a result of that. So now the whole Sea of Okhotsk now remains the lake of Pacific, Russian Pacific Fleet. So of course the Soviet Union didn't want to look lonely in this process, and Poles and Czechs were conveniently there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leonid. So the time is up. We're a little bit over, in fact. So I would like to now conclude the event today, and I'll do that by quoting extract from a speech of UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres recently, who mentioned that since the establishment of the United Nations, there hasn't been a major hot confrontation between global powers. So as a citizens of this world, I think everyone would agree that we hope it will continue this way, and we won't have any hot wars between major powers at all. And ourselves and our children will live in peaceful coexistence with each other and the Mother Nature. So I would like to thank our panel speakers today, Professor Roger Markwick, Professor Mark Ederle, Associate Professor Alexei Muravyev, Associate Professor Slobodan Vladiv-Glover, Dr. Leonid Petrov for their thought-provoking presentations. Also Griffith Asia Institute, including Professor Caitlin Burns, Alia Ravet and Natasha Veri to help to organize the event, as well as all the guests, including representatives of diplomatic corpus in Australia. So thank you very much for fighting your time this Thursday afternoon. So hope to see you again in our future events, and goodbye and have a nice evening.